Hi, my name is Ryan Wu. I'm co-presenting with Yan Chen, and we will be discussing about the research paper, Friends, the role of peer influence across adolescent risk behaviors, which was written by Dr. Kimberly Maxwell. This research project examined peer influence across five risk behaviors: cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, marijuana use, tobacco chewing, and sexual debut. The research was conducted with a total of 1,969 adolescents aged 12 to 18. They completed two waves of data collection. The research found that a random same-sex peer predicts a teen's risk behavior initiation. There's influence only to initiate cigarette and marijuana use, and that there is an influence to initiate and stop alcohol and chewing tobacco use. There are two main research questions for this research, which are whether peer influence on risk behavior initiation and whether peer influence on risk behavior cessation.
So I'll take over and talk about the method of this study. This study used a secondary data set, specifically the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, to look at these relationships. And within this larger data set, authors used the peer network data set, which Ryan mentioned was consisted of about 2,000 adolescent students in grades 7 through 12. One thing to note is this was not a nationally representative sample, and so this data set didn't technically, go to select random schools across the United States. But in reality, they looked at two specific schools. One was a predominantly white school, and one was more ethnically diverse. And both of these schools were in a major metropolitan area. And so as we think about these results, we need to consider that this isn't representative and can't be generalized to the entire US, for example. Now, in this data set, they conducted in-home interviews with students where they asked students to nominate up to 5 female and 5 male friends. And so they said, start with your closest friend, and then who's your next friend, and so on. And they also asked students about the risky behaviors that they've engaged in, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the next slide. They interviewed students in 2 waves. So these waves were about a year apart. So they started in April of 1995 and did the first wave of interviews until about December. And then they did the next wave of interviews, or time 2 interviews, in April of 96 up until August of 96. Now, to specifically talk about the measures that they used in this study, when we talk about peer influence, this specific study really wanted to account for the fact that there are selection processes where we tend to select friends and have friends who are like us in some way. They also wanted to account for the fact that some people or some kids would have a lot more friends than others, and some kids wouldn't. And so they really wanted to be consistent in how they think about who is a friend here. To do this, and there are pros and cons that the authors laid out in this article, but to do this, they randomly selected one teen's nominated friend. And so if you were the target adolescent that they were studying, they just picked one of your same-sex friends that you named, one of the 5. Now, this means that your friend could have held any position on this list. It could have been your best friend, or it could have been maybe the fifth same-sex friend that you noted. Now, this comes with an assumption that peers exert equal influence. Any close friend would exert the same amount of influence as, maybe a fifth person that you name. But this does end up being a good estimate of the average effect of a friend's behaviors because of that random selection. So some students would get their closest friend, but some students would get their 5th closest friend. And so they use this data of your matched friend behavior to predict your behavior. And again, I'll talk about that more in the next slide. The risk behaviors that the study specifically examined were smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, using marijuana, chewing tobacco, or having sex sort of ever, their sexual debut, they call it. And when they examined these risky behaviors, they dichotomized them. And so it didn't really matter, whether how much you smoke cigarettes, but it was more about, did you smoke cigarettes in the past 30 days at all or none? Now I'll talk about the analytical approach that the authors used. And so first, I wanted to break it down in a way that made a lot of sense to me. So the authors used a logistic regression, and they wanted to figure out what variables predicted an adolescent's time to risk behavior. So if you're the target adolescents, they wanted to figure out what contributed or perhaps explained some of the variance in the behaviors that you engaged in that following year. And so they did separate logistic regressions for each risky behavior of interest. So cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, etc. Now the outcome behavior, whether or not you engaged in one of these behaviors, they had several control variables in here. So things that the authors knew would be related to these risky behaviors in time 2. So of course, for example, your risky behavior in time 1, if you're smoking cigarettes at time 1, you're likely to smoke cigarettes at time 2. So they wanted to control for that. They also controlled for various demographic variables that they say are associated with these risky behaviors. So for example, your race, gender, or age. Now here's where things get interesting. They look at your friends' behavior. So they randomly select one of your friends, one of the 5 that you named, and they used their behavior at time 1 to predict your behavior at time 2. And then finally, they wanted to look at the interaction between your friend's behavior and your behavior at time 1 to see if those 2 factors together predict your risk behavior at time 2. So for example, if you didn't smoke, but your friend smoked, what does that look like? Versus maybe you already smoke and your friend doesn't smoke, what happens there? And so now Ryan's going to talk about our main findings.
The research revealed that a random same-sex friend influences an adolescent to change his or her risk activity level. That being said, after controlling for the adolescent's own T1 behavior, a respondent is on average 1.9 times more likely to exhibit a risk behavior at T2 if their friend reported the same behavior at T1. Influence from a friend was roughly equal for each risk behavior. Another finding is a friend's influence effect varies by the adolescent's T1 behavior and by risk behaviors. To be more specific, for cigarettes and marijuana, the influence effect from a using friend is greater on T1 non-users than it is on T1 users to maintain their cigarette and marijuana smoking behavior. For alcohol and chewing tobacco use, the influence occurs equally in 2 directions, to begin or maintain, and to avoid or stop the behavior, depending on the adolescent's T1 risk behavior status. And this finding suggests that peers may offer teens protection from some risk behaviors.
So now I'll talk about sort of the main takeaways from the study, which reiterates a lot of what Ryan just said in our main findings. So this study suggests that peers can influence adolescents to change their risk activity levels. However, I think it's important to note that that peer influence only explained, less than 1% of the variance in students' time to behaviors. And so this is really minimal. But the authors note that when you think about your middle school, high school relationships, these relationships are pretty unstable. And so that instability may diminish this effect. So, even if you did have a friend at time one, that friendship may have changed in the year. And so maybe that peer didn't really have a lot of influence on you. Second, these were randomly selected peers. So it wasn't your closest friend. And I think that that speaks to something going on here. Now, peer influence is greater to start risky behaviors, specifically for smoking or marijuana use. But it's about the same when you think about beginning, maintaining, or even stopping behaviors such as drinking alcohol or chewing tobacco. And so, like Ryan suggested, peers can also serve as a protection from different risk factors as well. So, if you didn't smoke at time one, peer influence was much stronger for you to start smoking at time two. Whereas if you were already drinking at time one, peer influence wasn't really that strong in whether or not you sustain that smoking behavior. Researchers also suggested that peer influence for these risky behaviors might be dependent on the behavior's social context. So if you think about smoking and the social context of smoking, it's a lot different than the social context of drinking. Whereas, you think about high school, a lot of partying, that's where the drinking behaviors come across. Whereas things like smoking is more of like a daily, like I might do it on the sidewalk as a high schooler. And of course, this was in, the late 90s, early 2000s as well. Now, this research doesn't come without its limitations. This was one of the few studies that employed a method that controlled for selection effects. So the fact that peers choose each other based on pre-existing similarities. And so we think about that random selection of a friend that they used. And it's possible that selection and peer influence occur simultaneously too. So this study took the approach of, okay, first I have this friend and this friend engages in this behavior and then I engage in this behavior. Whereas these things can occur at the same time. So I might actually become friends with someone based on the risky behaviors that they are engaging in. Another limitation of this study was that it only examined same-sex friends, and this was a factor of just how the data structure was set up. Again, they're using a secondary data set, so they didn't have a lot of control here. But we know that opposite friendships take on a completely different quality, especially in high school. I know I certainly engaged in some probably different behaviors just because I liked a guy in high school. Another limitation of this study was the variance in the time periods of measures. And so if you notice, when they looked at things like drinking behavior, they looked at it across 12 months. Whereas when they looked at smoking behaviors, they looked at, 30 days. In the past 30 days, have you engaged in this? And then even with the sex behaviors, they looked at, have you ever had sex? And not really how much sex have you had? This also speaks to the any or no behavior, the way they dichotomize these variables. And so I think there would be a difference in this study if you looked at sort of the level of behavior. So are you drinking just once in a year versus are you drinking, a couple of times every month, which would be a lot more dramatic for a high school student. So all this together, we did have some discussion questions for you all. First, we wanted to talk about, what are the other factors that you can think of that may make adolescents more or less susceptible to peer influence and engaging in these behaviors? Some factors that come to mind for me are, of course, friendship quality. So I might be more influenced by a friend who I'm really close with versus, maybe that fifth friend that I named. I also was thinking about perhaps peer status or popularity. When you think about, okay, if this fifth friend is really popular, I might be more likely to be influenced by them. Our second question for you all is, do you think these results would be similar if you consider different positive behaviors? So this specific study examined risk behaviors, but I think it'd be interesting to look at sort of the more positive behaviors that peers can have on adolescents. For example, I think specifically about, educational engagement. So if I have a friend who's really interested in, robotics, does that make me likely to engage in sort of STEM learning as well? And then finally, just based on your own experiences, what behaviors, either positive or negative, have you engaged in that you may not have without peer influence? So I think that could just be a fun question that we could all talk about and get to know each other. So these are our final questions. Thank you all so much for listening into this study.